It's good to be back for an evening worship service. Just to let you know, we're not purposefully keeping you in the dark with the electricity problems this morning. One of these lights are flickering, so we thought it's better to sit in a little bit of darkness than to have strobe lights in the church. This evening we open our Bibles to 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5. Reading from verse 1. Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. Younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. Honor widows who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. Only so far may the Lord bless the reading of His word. As I read that passage, a couple of things stand out to us. But I want us to focus in particular on verse 16. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. So as we open up this passage, we have here the apostolic instruction on caring for widows. The apostolic instruction on caring for widows. And so Paul writes to Timothy. You'll remember he writes to him so that we should know how one ought to behave in the household of God. So here are certain instructions for us so that we may know how God expects us to behave in His household. And in particular here, the practical matter of care. So the first two verses, he deals with Timothy, do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. So he tells Timothy how he ought to behave towards all the different folk in the church. Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. So always approach older men as you would a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters in all purity. And then he transitions into this portion of honor widows who are truly widows. Honor widows who are truly widows. If a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn. So here is the first instruction regarding the care of widows that Paul writes to Timothy. Let them first learn. Let them first learn. So let the children and grandchildren learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents. So when the church is to consider who are widows in the church, the first thing we ask is, where are the children and where are the grandchildren? What is the attitude of the children and the grandchildren toward their mother or their grandmother? Because the church needs to be involved here in letting them first learn. Let them learn. If you have a young child and you want to train that child to ride a bicycle, you take the whiteboard, you start drawing pictures of a bicycle, and you explain all the mechanics of how a bicycle looks and works and the theory of where you need to sit. Jed, is that how you learned to ride a bicycle? Your dad pulled out the whiteboard and he started drawing you a picture of a bicycle. He taught you by putting you on a bicycle and saying, ride. And just as children learn how to ride a bicycle with the father's hand firmly underneath the saddle and maybe on the shoulder of the child, don't think I'm motioning to throw someone out of the house. I'm motioning how to train someone to ride a bicycle. It's very similar. So you're training how to ride a bicycle so that they can develop a feel for this. Right? And just so the church is called here to come alongside those who do not know how to care for others. So just before we think that the church is supposed to just care for and just see, oh, this person is hungry, give them food, we're supposed to intelligently gauge what is the real need here. The real need of people is not so much physical need only. And if we only cater to the physical needs, we're declaring to people that our gospel is shallow. That our gospel is shallow. Because it's a gospel that only deals with material and superficial things. But the gospel of Christ is concerned with matters of the heart. And so the training that is involved is a training of our hearts so that we may serve and worship God from our hearts. But this is not something that happens by instinct. We don't instinctively know how to behave as Christians. We don't instinctively know what is right. We know that something ought to be done in terms of care if we see a need. But we're oftentimes left wondering, how do I best help in this situation? And so that's why it's so important for us, before we get involved with any care or helping of others, to also pray for the Lord to give us wisdom and insight from His Word to do so, and to pay attention to His teaching and to see the principles He lays out for us in His Word. And the reason that God does this by showing us how to care, He's also teaching us how He cares for us. So as you look at Paul's instruction to Timothy, reflect in your own mind how God cares for us, how God cares for the needy. So, if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. You see, when there's a great need, what happens when there is a great need? When there is a great need that you see someone having, our first response, especially if we feel ourselves unable to help, is to stand back. If you come across an accident on the highway, you may have maybe one or three responses. The first response is those of the curious, who drive by and they look. And what the curious folks don't realize is that oftentimes they hinder the responders to come to the accident, and they hinder the flow of traffic, and they make things difficult because they're there to just observe and watch. Can't turn their eyes away from this tragedy. So if there's someone in need in the church, that's sometimes what happens. People tend to stare That's how it becomes obvious. Something's wrong here. Everyone's staring at this person. Everyone's staring at the need. It's obvious. In other cases, you might know that you're not able to help by getting out of your car and administering first aid, but you can at least pick up your phone and call. If you don't see the first responders, call an ambulance or call someone. And then others, so terrified they might freeze, they might attempt to help and then all of a sudden realize I'm out of my depth and then draw away. So these are all various ways, and I'm sure you can think of way more ways in which people respond. These are just a couple of ones that I could come up with. But I want you to see in this crisis, if there's a widow who is left destitute, but she has children and grandchildren, the greatest need of the person is not so much, how will I physically be cared for? The question that's on the mind of the person in need is, who will care for me? And the church should not take the place of those who ought to care for their mothers and grandmothers. God, in giving certain instructions in terms of care, is always sensitive to the human relations involved. So we can never get involved without considering those human relationships. Because more importantly than having food to eat is the consideration who's eating with me. Right? In our day, that's a foreign concept because families tend to make food and then they all sit in front of a TV, each one in his own, and not even in front of a TV anymore, but each one with his cell phone, watching his own thing, being in his own mind. You would sit together in the olden days around a table and eat together and socialize during your time of eating. Care had a very personal, relational touch with the people closest to you. And the church is called in these instances to make sure that those challenges of care and things take place. We've already looked at Acts 6. You see, in the beginning of the church, there was a daily distribution that took place. And in Acts 6, there was a challenge with the daily distribution, and therefore the deacons were appointed to see to the distribution problems. But the church understood that their responsibility in the daily distribution, each one had a role to play. And here the church as well must consider the role of children and grandchildren in the care of a widow. And the church needs to let them first learn. So yes, there might be a coming alongside of those who do not know how to do this, to teach them and show them how to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents. And we must do this and hold forth, this is pleasing in the sight of God. To the children and the grandchildren, you say, this is pleasing in the sight of God. You have a desire to please God? Here is how you please God. Here is how you please God. Your parents who took care of you, who nurtured you, if they are in need of care and nurturing, it is only right that those whom they cared for and nurtured all their life would make some return and care and nurture them. You see, our whole philosophy in the modern day of care and taking care of people has shifted because we think material needs come above the spiritual needs. We have put material needs of people way above their spiritual needs. The first thing we're concerned for when we think of the care of people are their physical needs. And we don't only think of their physical needs in terms of they need 3 meals a day and they need a place to sleep. We oftentimes think of more than that. More than that in terms of their physical well-being. Parents are concerned that their children have a station in life which makes good money so that they can have 2 cars and have a nice house. These are oftentimes the things that are on the mind of people living in Pretoria. and Joburg and these places. People in our own area that think like that. But we must see that God has instituted this sort of care in the church and let the children and grandchildren learn. Verse 5 says, she who is truly a widow, left alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplication and prayers night and day. If there's a widow who doesn't have these relations, children and grandchildren, then she's alone, left all alone, no family. This is someone who is truly a widow, destitute. But only truly a widow because also she has set her hope on God and continues in supplication and prayers night and day. If you can use a picture of this widow who is truly a widow, what I came up with is Hannah in 1 Samuel. She wasn't a widow, she was married. She was a married woman. But the attitude before the Lord, her heart attitude before God, making her prayers and supplications known for her soul's need, is the kind of person we're talking about here. She who is truly a widow, left alone, has set her hope on God as Hannah set her hope on God, continues in supplication and prayers night and day. This true widow looks only to God, looks and trusts upon the Lord to provide for her need. And here the Lord has called the church to pay attention to such widows. You see, as Eli paid attention to Hannah and he misjudged the situation and thinking she's a drunkard, here is a priest not knowing how to pay attention to the flock of God. God is calling the church not to be like Eli, but to be like Christ, who sees the true need and is able to provide for that true need. Verse 6, but she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. So you have a contrast here between the true widow and the self-indulgent. She who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. What is self-indulgence? What is self-indulgence? You see, we need to reflect on this self-indulgence and care. Why does Paul bring these two ideas together? Care and self-indulgence. Because you don't want to provide care for a need, but it's actually fueling someone's self-indulgence. You want to be truly caring and not fueling self-indulgence. Here comes the principle. This is how God treats us. When God disciplines us, He disciplines us as sons. He wants us to behave like His children. He doesn't want us to behave like self-indulgent, spoiled brats. God doesn't raise spoiled brats. God raises godly men and godly women. God does not participate in fueling ungodly behavior in His children. And so the church ought not to encourage self-indulgent behavior in the people, in the congregants, in its members. The church is to show and come under the discipline of God and to show what it truly means to care for those who are truly in need. So that's why the contrast is there. Look at the widows and see. Look at their circumstance. Are they truly widows? Do they trust in the Lord? Are they disciplined children of God? Or are they self-indulgent? Because if they're self-indulgent, they still need to be trained in godliness. Then your primary relationship with them is not a relationship of care, although it may involve care, but it's not primarily care, it's primarily teaching and training. To those who have devoted themselves to the teaching and training and are godly women in the church, they require less training. But they're in the school of the older women training the younger women. They have come alongside the church in the church's mission to train and to teach. You see, just like you have elders who are the mature, godly men in the church, so also the widows in the church are like the elders in this, that they set an example and pattern for the young women of godly womanhood. So young women ought to be able to look at the widows of the church and to see older women trained in godliness, and these older women training the younger women for godliness. Do you realize, older women, the weight and the burden that's on your shoulders in the church to train the next generation in godliness? To train the next generation for godliness. And so the church is called to care for those. Paul says in verse 7, command these things as well so that they may be without reproach. You'll notice the overlap between the qualification or the characteristic of an elder and the characteristic of the widow here. To be without reproach, to be above reproach. Don't put a widow in a compromising position where she's not going to be above reproach. Don't put her in difficult situations where her integrity may be questioned. Command these things as well so that they may be above reproach. Teach these things in the church so that men should know how to behave as men, women should know how to behave as women, men may become godly and lead, and women be godly and lead. Command these things as well so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for the members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. If we cannot even do good works for those in our immediate households, if we cannot even get along with the folks in our homes, how do we expect to get along with people in the church? Because the people in church are just like the people in my home. They have the same problems. They have the same frustrations. They have the same habits. People are people are people. They don't differ that much. People are people are people. They don't differ that much. And if one person irritates you with this, then the next person will irritate you with the same thing. Because we have very similar habits, wants, and needs. And if it's the humanity that you despise in another person, you'll despise it in everyone else. If you despise members of your household, you'll despise folks in your church. If you don't get along with people, people won't get along with you. Don't think you need a change of scenery, because people are just people. They have the same heart, the same wants, the same needs, the same desires. You understand that I'm not saying that everyone is the same and no one is unique. But there are times to remind one another that our basic problems and frustrations are exactly the same. We need to see where we are very similar to one another. While there is talk of the uniqueness, but the uniqueness comes in when we talk about our good works. But when we talk about our evil and wickedness and our filth in our hearts, looks a lot the same. We only become different when there's a change in our heart and in our attitudes, and then the beauty of our uniqueness comes out through that change. But that's something we need to cultivate in the church, training ourselves for godliness, training ourselves for the good works that's required for us, taking up that call to worship God and to walk in His ways. Then our uniqueness shines forth. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Listen how people talk about members of their household. Listen how husbands talk about their wives. Listen how wives talk about their husbands. The way that a husband talks about his wife tells you way more about that husband than it does about his wife. The way that a wife talks about her husband tells you way more about the wife than it does about the husband. The way that parents talk about their children tells you way more about the parent than it does the child. The way that children speak of their parents tell you way more of the child than of the parent. Because you have an insight into how this person thinks about the other person. You don't know what that person thinks because you don't know that person. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for the members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. We must be especially careful of speaking of people outside of the church especially our family members, in a derogatory way of saying, but they're unbelievers and they don't know and they don't understand. To be dismissive of their needs and so as if to say, well, I don't have to care for them, I don't have to be nice to them because they're unbelievers and they're... We've had people come to prayer meetings and say, pray for my husband. He's an unsaved buffalo who treats me like dirt. No one has met that husband. Are we supposed to take the woman's word for it? Are we supposed to take her word for it? Or are we supposed to challenge and say, what makes him such a buffalo? Oh no, he expects me to cook and clean for him. Oh, and what does he do all day? Does he drink? No, he goes to work. He gets an income so that he can pay for the house. And you don't want to cook and clean for him? I think you need to go home and cook and clean. Let them learn. Let them learn. But this is a self-indulgent person, you see? We should not allow self-indulgent people to elicit sympathy from us. This isn't a hard teaching. This is simply a teaching to protect us from our own self-indulgence. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Paul elsewhere writes in Ephesians 4 that the thief should stop stealing. But that he doesn't stop being a thief just because he stopped stealing. He should stop stealing and start working. But he doesn't stop being a thief when he starts working. He stops being a thief when he has enough to share with others. You see, the opposite of self-indulgence and greed is sharing, giving away, generosity. And generosity is giving away without any strings attached. Not attaching strings to your generosity. Not saying I'll only care for you if you don't, if you do. A generous person gives away. And so in verse 9 we have the instruction here to Timothy, let a widow be enrolled. So it seems like there's a enrollment of the widows in the church. The church ought to know who the widows, the true widows, are. But if there's a knowledge of who the true widows are, there should also be those who are enrolled in let their children and grandchildren learn. It seems like the church is called, and the elders of the church are called to carefully distinguish and to see what the needs and the spiritual needs in particular are of the congregants. Carefully considering all the sheep and their needs. Elders need to be trained in this, how to look at the sheep and how to care and manage. So maybe elders will do well to pick up a farmer's book on training sheep and how to cultivate sheep. Sheep husbanding would be a good thing to read. Would be good to understand the dynamics of shepherding sheep. And the reason I say that is because God uses that image of shepherding people is not that much different than shepherding sheep. Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age. There's a clear age there. Not younger than 60. 60 years of age. Having been the wife of one husband. What is the status of her marital fidelity, in other words? Has she been faithful to one husband? This doesn't mean that she only had to be married once, because he's already talking about the younger widows who marry again. This just means that the same as it applies to the elders who are husbands of one wife, meaning a one-woman kind of man, she needs to be a one-man kind of woman. A one-man kind of woman. There must be a faithfulness and a purity, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. Having a reputation involves being known to the church. The true widows of the church are not those who all of a sudden, when their life falls apart, comes knocking at the door of the church and say, "We need help. My life is a mess." True widows are those who've been in church and have been given to good works, have devoted themselves to the teaching, are known to the congregation, have a reputation for good works. Having a good reputation means a lot of people know you and they don't speak badly of you. Have a good reputation in the church, having a reputation for good works. And here are a list of some of the things. So this is not applying every single thing but it gives you an idea of what these good works are. If she has brought up children. So it doesn't mean that the widows who never had children don't. This is one of the things. If she has children, that she raise them well. Consider her relationship with her children. If she has brought up children. But then also, if she has the children and the children are still living, then it goes back to 4. Let them first learn to show godliness. But if the children have passed away, or the grandchildren are unable, maybe they're too young, and she's caring for the grandchildren at a very young age, brings in a different dynamic. But you can see that there are clear principles given for us, given for the church to consider these things carefully. Having a reputation for good works, if she has brought up children, has shown hospitality. Another good work, has shown hospitality. And by the way, showing hospitality is not only inviting people to your home when your home is spotless. We oftentimes have to apologize, my home is not spotless. Hospitality doesn't mean your house was clean when everyone visited. Hospitality can mean your house was dirty, but you were hospitable and welcoming. And yes, I apologize for the dust, but it's more important that we spend this time together. And hospitability also means sometimes that when someone in the church who doesn't know the beginnings of how to be hospitable attempts to be hospitable toward you, do you go around to their house saying, "This cup is dirty. These plates aren't noritaki"? If someone invites you to show you some hospitality, how do you behave? Do you shun them for their shabbiness? Hospitality has to do with our heart attitude toward one another. Has shown hospitality. So I'm not saying purposefully give someone a dirty cup. I'm not saying purposefully leave your house. I'm just saying do the best you can, but don't worry that you don't have everything perfect. We should leave room for one another. Hospitality goes both ways. Has washed the feet of the saints, another good work. Has washed the feet of the saints. What does it mean to wash the feet of the saints? In those days, people would travel far on foot. And to welcome someone and to show them hospitality is to say to them, let me wash your feet, let me get the dirt off of your feet. It's like when someone comes from a long journey and you say, come and put your feet up. It might be when someone visits you from afar, you offer them to wash their car if it's dirty, to give them a cup of coffee when they feel like it, to give them some food. Washing the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry. Paul is making a statement here about the younger widows, not to enroll them. For when their passions draw them away from Christ, he just knows that a woman who has been married and has lost her husband has a deep, deep seated longing for companionship. And he says, don't let them be enrolled in the church as widows if they still have an opportunity to be married. Comes back to verse 16, let the church not be burdened. Let them marry. Don't stand in their way of marriage. Encourage them to marry again. But you also know all the other things involved in premarital, so it applies to those things again. Marry in the Lord. It's not to get married to anyone. It's the same principles of premarital and getting married the first time applies to the second marriage. The rules don't change with regards to marriage. The blueprint for marriage doesn't change. It's the same blueprint. It's the same steps. So let them marry. Let them marry. Verse 13, besides that, they learn to be idlers, going from house to house. You see, if you feel the self-indulgence of the widows, what you'll end up with is you'll end up with laziness. They learn to be idlers, going about from house to house. Have you ever had a lazy person in your house who doesn't lift a finger to do anything? They just won't leave. And when you're rid of them, you think, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to entertain this person anymore. They learn to be idlers. Husbands might feel this way about their mother-in-laws sometimes. Give them some work. Give them some work so that they're not idlers. They must learn not to be idlers, going about from house to house. You see, this is the picture then of what happens to these widows. They go about from house to house. They end up getting together for a Bible study where they are not interested in answering any questions that the pastor asks them in the Bible study, but they're more interested in the coffee afterwards and the gossip. And they don't come to church on Sunday, but they visit one another during the week, Monday to Saturday. And then the pastor preaches messages, and they're not in church. And then he has to deal with these busybodies Monday to Friday because they work one another up. They have WhatsApp groups and they get irritated with one another. Pastor, she said this. And then the pastor just says, thank the Lord for 1 Timothy 5, and deletes himself from the WhatsApp group. I'm done with this. It's not Bible study. That's not church. That's not church. You can have tea in your house and speak about the church however you want to. That doesn't bother us. It's only a testimony of what's going on in your heart. You should look in the mirror and be frightened. Record your own session of gossip and then listen to it by yourself. And ask yourself, would you like to spend time with such people? You see, this morning we had a lesson on excommunication, church discipline, and then the excommunication. When is someone put out of the church? And what you'll find most of the time is the church is not the final instrument of kicking someone out, and there's the excommunication. The beginning of excommunication is with the hardened heart. I refuse to listen to my brother when he speaks to me by myself. I refuse to listen to the two witnesses that he brings. I refuse to listen to the church. I refuse. A person who's been excommunicated has refused at least 4 or 5 times to change his way and to change his heart. He's excommunicated himself by being hardened against Christ. The church is only recognizing the hardness of the heart of the person. The church didn't hurt you by excommunicating you. You hurt the church by your self-indulgence, your idolatry, your immorality. Be careful to listen when people say, I've been hurt by the church. Ask them the question, and how have you hurt the church where you came from? Have you thought about that? Have you considered the hurt you have caused? Because most of the time people don't think of the hurt they cause. It's just ow. And most of the time it's like the guys after a rugby match in the emergency room. If they don't get enough attention, just shout louder. Guy sits there and he feels, I've got a pain of 7 out of 10, and the guy in the next room is screaming, and he thinks, I'm never going to get attention if I don't start screaming. The church should be able, and elders need to be able to say, the widows making the most noise about help me, help me, help me, are oftentimes not the widows needing the care and the help. It's those who go about and setting their hope on God and not saying a word about their need, that we need to be careful to discern and to see these are the ones who truly need help and care. So that we don't promote self-indulgence and more ungodliness, but that we truly come alongside our sisters in Christ. And so, as we enable the elders and pastors to do the work which they have been called to, the good work, so also the widows in the church can be doing the good work that they are called to. So you see, widows in the church aren't called to just be idlers and sitting back. You've got work to do. There's no retirement. In fact, the 60-year-olds, that's not an age of retirement, that's the age of enrollment. You start your work then. It's not a finish line, it's the start of the work. It's the start of a new phase of work. God has a glorious call on your life within the congregation to do this. And why preach about this when there's not a lot of 60-year-old and older women in the church? Well, someday you might be 60. Simon, someday you might be 60. Donnie, someday you might be 60. And then you would have heard this, and you would have had a lifetime to think about and to be prepared and trained for when you're 60 to begin that work. You see, I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households. But we look at verse 13 again. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going from house to house, not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things that they should not say, saying what they should not. You see, even Paul says they ought to keep their mouth shut because they're saying the things they shouldn't be saying. They should be silent. And you feel it when the idle person is in your home. Oh, just stop talking and do something. Just stop talking and do something. So I would have the younger widows marry, bear children, manage their own households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. You see, this is the concern. Young widows should marry, bear children, manage their household. They should be busy about the Lord's work, not busy about gossip and going around messing up other people's homes. You see, the widows who become idlers are just like the false teachers who prey upon the weak, who upset households, who wreck things, who bully people in their own homes. The husband of the home, the head of the home, should not stand for such bullying. But also, if there's no husband to stand up against the bullies, the elders in the church should be able to stand up against the bullies and say, not in this house, not in the house of our members. Just to prepare the elders, you'll have to do this again and again and again and again. And what sometimes happens is that those whom you thought were sheep turn on you. You go around telling a boyfriend of a widow in the church, you're living together, you ought not to. You should get married. And then the widow in the church turns upon her pastor and says, but pastor, we're grown-ups. Dear sister, you're a daughter of your Father in heaven. Your Father in heaven wouldn't want you to live with this man before you get married. He didn't want you to live with a man at a young age. He doesn't want you to live with a man in an old age. Age doesn't matter. Then you weep when they leave the church. What can you do? You see, God told Ezekiel was called as a prophet to be a watchman over God's people. He told Ezekiel, if you told them, if you warned them about the dangers that are to come, their blood is on their hands if they don't listen to you. Their blood is on their hands if they don't listen to you. But if you don't tell them, their blood is on your hands. That's why Paul, when he spoke to the Ephesian elders, told them, I am innocent of your blood because I told you, taught you, you knew, you know. That's why we don't shy away from something like 1 Peter 5 and the preaching. You know. You can prepare yourself. I told you. You know. Verse 15, you see what I'm preparing you for. For some have already strayed after Satan. Some have already strayed. I've given you an example just now. There's more than just one. Some have already strayed after Satan. We pray for those who strayed after Satan, but just like Paul told the Corinthian church, I've given them over to Satan so that they may learn not to blaspheme. So also in this case, some have strayed after Satan. Can only pray that they come to their senses, that they come to themselves. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Another aspect to care. Another aspect to care. If any believing woman has relatives, so this is any believing woman, not just the widows, not just those over 60, any believing woman have relatives who are widows. Are you a relative of a widow? Care for them. Care for them. You can't care for the widows in general. You can't care for the widow that's closest to you. You see, we oftentimes think the commandments of the Lord apply to us in the furthest reaches of the world. When we read something like go and make disciples, we immediately think Cuba, Papua New Guinea. How many of you think in terms of Rooihuiskraal, How many of you think of the youths right next to us, the young people who are being watched during the day by teachers who don't pay attention to their souls, who scroll on their phones mindlessly while the kids do all sorts of things? And while they put the world's garbage on through the microphone, through the speakers, and you think this music is too rough for certain nightclubs in Pretoria. Pray for the souls right next door. Pray for the souls across the street. Because making disciples involves them. You can't care for those in Papua New Guinea if you don't care for those next to you. You can't care for your brothers and sisters in the church if you can't care for your family members sitting right next to you. This is the apostolic instruction regarding the care not only of widows. You see the principles, how they apply to every area of our life. And they apply precisely because this is how God cares for His children. He cares for them to their spiritual benefit. God doesn't want self-indulged children. He wants godly men and godly women. And He will train us and discipline us so that He may present the church to Himself without spot or wrinkle to His own glory. How wonderful. He does that. We just reap the benefits. We get to follow Him. It's not, you understand what I'm saying? This is not a burden to say, oh, now I have to do. I get to do this. We get to do this. And just like Jesus said to Judas, leave her, she's doing a good work, in in John 12, when Mary prepares Jesus for the grave, and He tells Judas, leave her alone. If you're busy about the work of Jesus, Jesus will also tell those who bother you, leave him. Leave her. But then Jesus stands up for us and tells the rest, leave him. Leave her. May the Lord help us. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank You so much for Your word that instructs us, that gives us so much practical help in terms of the care of the widow, but also in the teaching of how to care for the widow. And so, Lord, we see how each one of us in the body is responsible together as a church to live in the fear and the discipline of the Lord so that we may care. And, O Lord, if we live before You as disciplined children, we thank You, O Lord, that You are advancing Your kingdom. For us, it might not feel like important work, but oftentimes the most important work that we need to do is to just maintain what You have already done, to remain at our post, to be content with what You give to us. Lord, help us. Give us strength to remain standing, and help us to bear with one another, pray for one another, and properly, Lord, care for one another. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's now stand and sing together. Let's prayerfully sing together hymn 346, A Christian Home. So let's pray this for one another, that we have Christian homes.